Warframe has over 50 playable characters, and with that many, Digital Extremes was bound to create a few monsters. So in today's video, we'll rank every Warframe in the game. We'll talk about what each frame does, rate them from S to D tier, and provide a build you can use. And since Warframe is literally the space ninja game, it only makes sense to start with the actual ninja, Ashe. Ashe is basically what happens when Warframe takes the ninjas play free slogan literally. He can turn invisible, throw shurikens, teleport to enemies, and mark entire groups for assassination. So if you want a frame that feels like a proper space ninja, Ashe is probably the closest thing in the game. And the star of the show is his fourth ability, Blade Storm. Activating it lets you tag multiple enemies across the entire area, and once reactivated, will summon shadow clones that teleport between every marked enemy and strike them all down. The clones are a little slow on their own, but we can actually cast our third ability on any marked enemy while this is happening, and we will join our shadow clone, striking all remaining marked enemies in a cinematic cutscene while being completely invulnerable the entire time. But what makes Bladestorm truly special is that it deals true damage, meaning it bypasses armor entirely and scales incredibly well at higher levels. Very well, in fact, that it can even one-shot enemies at level cap, which is honestly pretty impressive. But in order to actually get to his enemies safely, his second ability, Smokescreen, is what keeps Ashe alive. Casting it drops a smoke bomb that turns Ashe completely invisible. And since enemies simply cannot see you while you're invisible, this is his main way of staying out of trouble. Furthermore, with the Augment Smoke Shadow, nearby allies also get cloaked alongside you, and everyone gets a boost to their critical chance while active, so it doubles up as a nice offensive tool too. And lastly, his first ability hurls a pair of homing shurikens at nearby enemies, and with the Augment Seeking Shuriken, it can completely strip away an enemy's armor in a single throw with enough ability strength. And for newer players, armor is a stat that makes enemies take significantly less damage, so being able to remove it entirely is a huge deal, especially against heavily armored factions like the Grineer. Now, if you want to try Ashe out for yourself, here's a quick build to get you started. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Ashe in A tier. Next up, we have Atlas. And if you've ever wanted to feel like an unstoppable Warframe that can punch your enemy's entire bloodline out of existence, then Atlas is your guy. And the star of the show is his first ability, Landslide. Upon casting it, we will dash forward and deliver a powerful punch to our target. And the best part is that we're completely invulnerable during the entire animation. Furthermore, each punch hits all enemies within a 6-meter radius, so it's not just the one enemy in front of you taking damage. And what makes it truly special is that Landslide scales directly with our mods, meaning that with the right build, it can deal millions, sometimes even billions, of raw damage per punch. It's honestly one of the most satisfying abilities in the entire game. I mean, just listen to this. And honestly, Atlas is also surprisingly tanky. And a big reason for that is his passive Rubble. So whenever you turn enemies into stone using his third ability and kill them, they drop chunks of rubble on the ground. And picking them up will either heal you if you're injured, or stack bonus armor if you're already at full health. And since Atlas already has a ton of base armor to begin with, stacking even more of it makes him incredibly hard to kill. And if you want to try Atlas out for yourself, here's a quick build to get you started. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Atlas in A tier. Next up, we have Banshee, and if you're looking for a frame that can make your weapons hit like an absolute truck, then Banshee is exactly that. And the star of the show is her second ability, Sonar. Casting it tags all nearby enemies and highlights a specific weak spot on each of them. And any damage dealt to those weak spots receives a massive damage multiplier, which means that every hit on those spots deals significantly more damage than usual. Furthermore, the weak spot multiplier actually stacks with itself, so casting Sonar multiple times increases our damage even further. And honestly, back in the day, if you wanted to flex those insane damage number screenshots to your friends, Banshee was the frame you went to. Just stack a few casts of Sonar on a single enemy, hit the weak spot, and suddenly you're posting billions of damage in the Warframe subreddit. And with the Augment Resonance, killing an enemy through their weak spot automatically triggers another Sonar pulse, which means that you barely even need to recast it as long as you're consistently hitting those highlighted spots. And her third ability, Silence, is also pretty useful. Casting it creates an aura around us that briefly stuns any enemy that walks into it. And on top of that, it also disables their abilities entirely while they're inside the field. But Banshee does have a pretty significant weakness, because she has issues with survivability. And unlike some other frames, she doesn't really have a reliable way to stay alive on her own. I'm using Omamori in the footage just to keep me alive. So unless you're shield gating or using the Helminth system to bring in a survivability option, she can feel pretty fragile. But if you want to try Banshee out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Banshee in B tier. Next up we have Baruuk, and his signature ability is his Exalted Fist that shoots out powerful waves with each punch. They're capable of wiping out entire groups of enemies at once, and his slide attack in particular is incredibly powerful, capable of one-shotting even the toughest enemies in the game. But in order to use his Exalted Fists, we first need to erode his restraint gauge first. And the easiest way to do that is by spamming his second ability on groups of enemies, which puts them to sleep and depletes his restraint in the process. And this is actually where one of his weaknesses shows up, because he works best when played solo. Because in a squad, enemies tend to die too quickly, making it harder to consistently stay in his exalted form. But weaknesses aside, Baruuk is actually incredibly tanky, because he has 3 sources of damage reduction that can stack with one another to give us up to nearly 99% damage reduction. And the first of which comes from his restraint gauge itself, because when fully depleted, it provides us with a nice 50% damage reduction. Couple that with his third ability, which gives us an additional 90% damage reduction, and even his Exalted Stance, which provides us with an extra 40% damage reduction, and we're basically unkillable. He basically feels like a better Excalibur, but only if you're playing solo. And if you want to try him out for yourself, here's a quick build that works great for Steel Path. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Baruuk in A tier. Next up we have Caliban, and if you've ever wanted to feel like a sentient overlord with an army of alien creatures to do your bidding, then Caliban is exactly that. And the star of the show is his third ability, Lethal Progeny. Casting it summons a squad of minions that fight alongside you, and the ones you really want are the Ortholists, which are ranged minions that fire explosive shots at enemies and deal an insane amount of damage. And with the Augment Razor Mortar, using his first ability to spin into enemies will pull them all together, and your Ortholist will immediately teleport and focus fire on the grouped enemies with increased fire rate and damage, which means that it pretty much makes anything you spin through melt instantly. But to make our Ortholist hit even harder, our second ability sends out a shockwave that lifts nearby enemies into the air while applying a damage vulnerability to them. This means that they take increased damage from all sources. But to take things even further, our fourth ability fires a powerful beam that strips enemies of their armor and shields, making them take even more damage. But with that much damage, surely he must be pretty squishy, right? Well, fortunately for us, our first ability lets us gain shields and health for every enemy hit, allowing us to easily get over shields and even shield gate. And since we don't have to use weapons to wipe out enemies, we could even equip the Shade Companion. This will provide us with near permanent invisibility, making us pretty much unkillable. Now, if you want to try Caliban out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Caliban in S tier. Next up we have Chroma, and if you're looking for a frame that can buff your weapons while being pretty tanky, then Chroma can do that. But honestly, the main reason most players pick him up is for something a little more specific, and we'll get to that in a second. His second ability releases an aura based on his chosen element that buffs either his armor, fire rate, or other stats depending on what element you have chosen. And his third ability, Vex Armor, is where his weapon buffing comes in, because it increases both his armor and base weapon damage. And those two abilities together do make him a decent tank and weapon platform. But there are other frames on this list that simply does both of those, but better. So what does Chroma do better than almost anyone else? Well, that's his fourth ability, Effigy. Casting it detaches his pelt as a stationary turret that attacks nearby enemies, and more importantly, it doubles all credit pickups for the duration, as long as you're within its range. This makes Chroma essentially the go-to frame for any dedicated credit farming run, particularly for the Profit Taker boss fight, or Helvania Techrot safes, which already drop massive amounts of credits on their own. So while he's not the most well-rounded frame on this list, that credit farming niche alone makes him worth having in your arsenal. And this is the general build that I'm using for Chroma. But if you intend to use him for the Profit Taker boss fight, you should probably get a specialized build and loadout for it. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Chroma in B tier. But he gets a shout out for being the best credit farming frame in the game. Next up we have Citrine, and if you're looking for a frame that can lock down enemies, deal massive critical damage, and keep herself and her allies alive at the same time, then Citrine does all of that surprisingly well. And the star of the show is her fourth ability, Crystallize. Casting it sends out crystal shards that rush forward and seek out nearby enemies, paralyzing them in crystalline growths. Furthermore, hitting the crystal growth directly sets weapon critical chance to 300%, which means that we're able to go from this to that. And her third ability deploys a gem that fires beams at enemies. Furthermore, allies within its range also gain increased status chance and duration. But the best part is that with its augment mod, it can actually attach to our companions. And using the mod Contagion Bond, it can actually trigger massive nukes on groups of enemies. And as for survivability, her second ability surrounds her and nearby allies with a protective barrier that reduces incoming damage, which is her main way of staying alive. And her first ability is also worth mentioning, because it increases the chance of enemies dropping health and energy orbs when hit, which pairs really nicely with her passive that heals her and allies passively and increases permanently whenever health orbs are picked up. So the more you cast it, the more orbs you generate, and the more healing you have available. And if you want to try Citrine out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. She's overall a really strong frame, but I do feel that her abilities pale in comparison to other Warframes on this list. And because of that, I'm placing Citrine in B tier. Next up we have Cyto9, and if you've ever wanted to play a precision marksman that can see and shoot through walls, buff his own weapons, go invisible, and then delete enemies with a powerful exalted sniper rifle, then Cyto9 is exactly that. And the star of the show is his fourth ability. Casting it equips an exalted sniper rifle that is incredibly powerful on its own. But what makes it truly special is how well it synergizes with the rest of his kit, because every other ability he has directly makes this weapon hit even harder. Starting with his first ability, casting it plants an antenna that scans nearby enemies and highlights their weak points through walls. And this is huge, because not only can you now see and shoot enemies through walls, but those highlighted weak points also take massively increased damage. Furthermore, it also gives your weapons infinite punch-through against terrain, so bullets pass straight through walls and obstacles entirely. And his passive stacks on top of this too, because every time you kill an enemy by hitting their weak point, we permanently gains additional critical chance, which keeps getting stronger the more you play. And his second ability throws out elemental ammo packs that instantly refill your magazine, while adding an extra instance of elemental damage to every shot. So you're essentially buffing your damage even further on top of everything else that's already going on. As for survivability, his third ability turns us completely invisible. And here's the neat part, because killing enemies through their weak points actually extends the invisibility duration. So as long as you're hitting those highlighted spots, we can pretty much permanently remain invisible. Put it all together and you have a frame that spots enemies through walls, buffs his own damage, goes invisible to stay safe, and then picks off everything with an incredibly powerful sniper rifle. Every ability feeds directly into the next, and it just feels really satisfying to play. And if you want to try Cyto9 out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Cyto9 in S tier. Next up we have Dagath, and if you've ever wanted to play a frame that is literally unkillable while dealing an insane amount of damage at the same time, then she is exactly that. And the star of the show is her third ability. And with the Augment Spectral Spirit, it literally makes her immortal. But that's not even the best part, because it also gives her a massive critical damage bonus. And on top of that, it automatically applies Doom to all your abilities and weapons. And Doom is actually the core of her entire kit, so let me quickly explain what it does. When an enemy is doomed, a sickle appears above their head and stores a portion of all the damage you deal to that enemy, and then releases it all at once as true damage. Furthermore, her first ability actually helps spread that Doom effect even further. Casting it launches a flurry of scythes that shoot out at enemies, and when those scythes hit a doomed enemy, the curse immediately spreads to all enemies around them. So with a single ability cast, you can have an entire room of enemies doomed and ready to be wiped out. And not to worry if you don't have any good weapons, because that's where her fourth ability comes in. Casting it summons a stampede of spectral horses that charges through enemies and deals a massive amount of damage. But what makes it truly special is that when it hits doomed enemies, it permanently strips their armor and shields. The damage output is genuinely insane, and it's more than capable of wiping out even Steel Path Eximus units without needing any mods at all. But if you just want something to get started with, Here's a quick build that works great for base steel path. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Dagath in S tier. Next up we have Dante. And if you've ever wanted to play as a mage that casts powerful spells and obliterates enemies with arcane energy, then he is exactly that. And honestly, he is one of the most powerful frames in the entire game right now, because he just offers so much. Now the core of his kit revolves around 2 abilities. His second ability, Light Verse, which on its own grants Dante and nearby allies a chunk of overguard on cast. And for newer players, overguard is basically a powerful shield that sits on top of your health and regular shields, and it even blocks status effects. And his third ability, Dark Verse, which on its own deals / damage to nearby enemies with a guaranteed bleed proc, causing them to bleed out over time. But here's where it gets really interesting, because depending on the order you cast Light Verse and Dark Verse, his fourth ability produces a completely different spell. So Dante essentially has 4 different ultimates depending on how you compose your verses. Casting Light Verse twice followed by his ultimate gives you Triumph, which instantly grants a massive amount of overguard to Dante and his entire squad. And every kill your squad makes, while Triumph is active, generates even more overguard, meaning your team stays protected almost indefinitely as long as you keep fighting. This is one of the best support abilities in the game, because you essentially turn your entire squad into tanks that not only have a massive amount of overguard, but are also immune to status effects. Casting Dark Verse twice, followed by his ultimate, gives you Tragedy, which is his main nuke. Tragedy takes all the / and bleed damage that enemies have accumulated from your Dark Verses, and compresses it all into one massive single hit across a huge area. The damage is genuinely insane, and it's more than capable of clearing entire rooms in Steel Path effortlessly. The other 2 ultimates, Word Warden and Page Flight, summon spectral companions that deal additional damage, prime enemies with / status, and draw enemy aggro away from you. And keeping all of these buffs active at the same time is what truly makes Dante shine. And on top of all of that, his first ability opens his Exalted Tome, which works as a great primer to apply viral status on enemies before dropping Tragedy on them, making the nuke hit even harder. Dante genuinely does it all. He keeps his squad alive, nukes entire rooms, and brings a ton of utility. And if you want to try Dante out for yourself, here's the build I'm using that works great for Steel Path. And honestly, if I could place him in a tier above S, I would. But the one thing holding him back is that he does consume a lot of energy to keep all his spells going. So S tier it is, because anything higher and Digital Extremes would probably be sending out a hotfix pretty quickly. Next up we have Ember. And if you've ever wanted to rain meteors down on enemies and set entire rooms ablaze, then Ember is exactly that. Her fourth ability is the star of the show. Casting it calls down a barrage of meteors that crash into enemies across a wide area, dealing heavy heat damage and setting everything on fire. And with enough enemies burning around her, her passive actually kicks in and gives her bonus ability strength for every enemy affected by heat status nearby, which means the more chaos you create, the harder she hits. Now her second ability is what makes her other abilities stronger. Activating it surrounds her in flames that give her damage reduction, and the higher the heat gauge climbs, the more damage reduction she gets and the harder her abilities hit. However, the gauge keeps rising over time, and if it overheats, she starts rapidly draining energy. So managing that gauge is actually a pretty important part of playing her, and that's where her third ability comes in. Casting it releases a ring of fire around her that not only cools down the heat gauge, but also strips enemy armor in the process. But here's the thing. While all of that sounds decent, I find that she simply struggles to keep up with newer weapons or Warframes. Her damage output isn't quite where it needs to be against high-level enemies, and there are other frames on this list that nuke rooms far more effectively, and bring a lot more to the table overall. But if you want to try her out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Ember in C tier. Next up, we have Equinox. And if you've ever wanted to play a frame that can switch between 2 completely different forms, each with their own set of abilities, then she is exactly that. Her first ability lets her shift between her day form and night form. But the star of the show is her fourth ability in day form called Maim. Activating it releases an aura around her that deals / damage to all nearby enemies, and every enemy that dies within it while Maim is active charges up a damage counter. And when you deactivate it, all that stored damage is released in one massive burst that hits everything in range. So the longer you keep it active and the more enemies you kill, the bigger and more devastating the explosion becomes when you finally let it go. This is one of Warframe's largest and most powerful nukes, especially since it goes through walls. But in order to actually survive long enough to charge up that damage counter, we need to make use of her night form. Swapping into night form gives her bonus armor and shields, and her second ability in this form allows us to put enemies in an area to sleep, making our life a whole lot easier. Plus, we can even sleep them through walls. Furthermore, her third ability also creates an aura that reduces the damage output of all enemies around her, making her a lot more comfortable to play around. Additionally, her fourth ability in night form gives us an aura that gives us shields every time we kill an enemy. And her gameplay loop is actually quite simple. Activate our fourth ability while in day form to start charging up our nuke, then switch to night form to put enemies to sleep and get extra survivability. We'll then kill a bunch of enemies and proceed to switch to day form to nuke the map. And if you want to try Equinox out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Equinox in A tier. Next up we have Excalibur, and chances are you actually already have him, because a special version of him called Excalibur Umbra is rewarded to you directly through one of the earlier story quests. And the star of the show is his fourth ability. Activating it summons a powerful sword of pure energy that sends out waves with every swing. But what I personally love most about this ability is the heavy attack, because performing a heavy attack sends out two massive energy slashes in a cross pattern that can nuke entire groups of enemies at once. It's incredibly satisfying and honestly one of the coolest looking attacks in the game. Now to make those waves hit even harder, his third ability, Radial Javelin, is where things get interesting. Casting it launches a volley of javelins that impale nearby enemies. And with the augment Furious Javelin, every enemy that gets hit by the javelins grants Excalibur a stack of bonus melee damage. So the more enemies you hit with it, the harder your Exalted Blade gets buffed after. And with the augment Chromatic Blade, the damage type of Exalted Blade changes to match Excalibur's chosen energy color, which also massively boosts its status chance, letting you stack powerful status effects on top of everything else. And this is the build that I'm using for Excalibur Umbra. And I don't think it's like the most optimal one, but it's the build that I enjoy running. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Excalibur in A tier. Next up we have Follie, and she is, in my opinion, one of the most creative frames added to Warframe, because if you've ever wanted to play as a mischievous painter that summons anything she draws, then Follie is exactly that. And the star of the show is her second ability, Shadowgraph. Casting it opens up a sketchbook menu where you can summon a wide variety of objects directly onto the battlefield. And the ones you'll be using most are the Explosive Barrel, Arc Trap, and the RPG. Because what makes these so powerful is that they deal damage based on a percentage of the enemy's maximum health, meaning they hit way harder the tougher enemies are. So Acolytes, Eximus units, and Steel Path enemies all take a massive amount of damage from these objects. An Explosive Barrel alone deals 65% of an enemy's health in a single detonation, and the RPG can straight up one-shot Acolytes right out of the box. Shadowgraph is genuinely one of the strongest damage tools in the game right now. But beyond just damage, Follie can also summon actual mission utility objects through Shadowgraph, like life support capsules to keep your oxygen topped up in survival missions, conduit keys to progress disruption missions, and even a lost spirit to help you locate Syndicate medallions. She is literally the first frame in the game that can do something like that, and it makes her an incredibly versatile pick across a huge range of mission types. But Shadowgraph aside, Follie also has mobility and survivability built right into her kit with her first ability. Casting it has Follie dive into a portal on the ground and instantly reappear at a targeted location. It's basically a teleport. And upon emerging, she gains 3.5 seconds of complete invulnerability, which is a massive window to reposition and recover. On top of that, it also cleanses all status effects on cast, so if you're ever getting stacked up with debuffs, a quick Force Perspective sorts that out immediately. Now if you want to try Follie out for yourself, here's a quick build to get you started. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Follie in S tier. Next up we have Frost, and if you've ever wanted to play as the king of ice and snow that can freeze entire rooms, strip enemy armor, and keep his whole squad protected at the same time, then Frost is exactly that. And the star of the show is his fourth ability, Avalanche. Casting it releases a massive shockwave that freezes every enemy in a huge radius, completely immobilizing them. But the really important part is that it also strips their armor. meaning enemies go from being heavily protected to completely exposed in one button press. And with the augment Icy Avalanche, every enemy hit by Avalanche also grants Overguard to Frost and his entire squad. So every cast is simultaneously crowd-controlling enemies, stripping their armor, and keeping your team protected all at once. It's an incredibly efficient ability. And speaking of weapons, his passive actually has a really nice augment called Biting Frost, which gives Frost himself a massive boost to critical chance and critical damage against any enemy affected by a cold status effect. And since Avalanche applies cold to everything in range, you're essentially getting a free weapon damage buff after every single cast. And his third ability creates a protective dome around a location that blocks all incoming projectiles. It's a nice defensive tool, and makes him a pretty strong pick for defense missions where protecting a stationary objective is a priority. Something to note, however, is that Eximus units are immune to Avalanche since they have Overguard, which is a pretty significant weakness. And while Snow Globe is useful, allies outside the globe can't shoot enemies inside it, so frames like Gara, who can cast directly on the objective without that restriction, can be a more practical option. And for Overguard generation, frames like Dante do it better and more consistently too. But if you want to try Frost out for yourself, here's a quick build to get you started. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Frost in B tier. Next up we have Gara. And if you've ever wanted to play a glass warrior that becomes increasingly more deadly the longer a mission goes on, then Gara is exactly that. And the star of the show is her second ability, Splinter Storm. Casting it surrounds Gara in a swirling storm of razor-sharp glass fragments that deals continuous damage to any enemy that gets close enough to touch her. And the really impressive part is that this damage stacks infinitely, meaning the more you build it up, the harder it hits. So enemies will literally just die from walking near you, which is incredibly satisfying. And on top of dealing damage, Splinter Storm also gives Gara a solid chunk of damage reduction while it's active, making her surprisingly tanky. And you can even cast it on allies and objectives, giving them damage reduction too. But to actually stack that damage up, we need her other abilities. Her first ability has her slash enemies with a glass sword, and here's the key part. Casting it on her fourth ability's barrier causes it to explode outward in a burst of glass fragments, and 50% of that explosion damage gets permanently added to Splinter Storm's damage per second. So the more you explode the barrier, the deadlier Splinter Storm becomes. Furthermore, casting her fourth ability also refreshes the duration of Splinter Storm, so you can maintain it indefinitely as long as you keep casting. And energy is rarely an issue either, because her third ability summons a circle of mirrors that draws enemy fire, and with its augment, enemies killed inside the circle has really high chance to drop energy orbs, keeping you well supplied throughout the mission. And if you want to try Gara out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Gara in A tier. Next up, we have Garuda. And if you've ever wanted to play a blood mage that can infinitely scale her damage and nuke enemies with a single throw, then she is exactly that. And the star of the show is her first ability. Casting it has us pounce on our targeted enemy and rip out a portion of that enemy's maximum health to charge up our blood bomb. So the tougher the enemy, the more damage our blood bomb will do, and we can actually cast it multiple times before throwing the bomb, stacking the damage counter even higher. Furthermore, holding down the ability will continuously multiply its damage while draining our energy, which means it effectively scales infinitely. So with some charge, a single throw of our blood bomb can wipe out entire groups of enemies in one hit. But even if any enemies somehow survive the initial throw, our fourth ability guarantees they won't stay alive for long. Casting it fires a volley of blades at nearby enemies that mark them, and marked enemies have a very high chance to trigger slash procs from any damage they receive. And what makes this especially powerful is that the slash proc scales directly with the damage dealt, meaning if our blood bomb hits for millions of damage, the bleed that follows is just as massive, so even enemies that survive the initial throw will quickly get finished off by the bleed. Now, energy sustain is something a lot of nuke frames struggle with, but Garuda completely solves that with her third ability, Bloodletting. Casting it sacrifices a portion of her own health to instantly restore a large chunk of energy, and she has so many ways to restore that health back, that running out of energy is genuinely never a concern. It's essentially an infinite loop of health converting to energy, and energy converting right back. But if you just want something to get started with, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Garuda in S tier. Next up we have Gauss, and if you've ever wanted to play a frame that feels like a speedster on steroids, then Gauss is exactly that. And his first ability is one of the most fun abilities in the game. Tapping it sends us dashing forward in a short burst, but holding it down has us sprinting forward at an insane speed that just feels incredible to play. And his second ability is his main survivability tool. Activating it gives Gauss a layer of armor that absorbs damage from most sources completely, and on top of that, it also makes him immune to knockdown and stagger, and even converts a small portion of absorbed damage back into energy. But his third ability is where things get really interesting, and it comes in two flavors. Tapping it applies a cold effect to nearby enemies, while holding it applies heat instead. And when you cast the opposite element on enemies already affected by one of them, it triggers a blast proc that strips their armor and releases all the stored heat damage at once. So with the right build, all you need to do is to cast the heat version 2 to 3 times, followed by a single cold cast, and Steel Path enemies will easily vanish from your screen. And his fourth ability is what transforms Gauss into a weapons powerhouse. Activating it gives us a massive boost to our fire rate, reload speed, melee attack speed, and casting speed. But if you just want something to get started with, then here's the build that I'm using in the footage. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Gauss in S tier. Next up we have Grendel, and if you've ever wanted to play a big hungry Warframe that literally eats enemies whole, then Grendel is exactly that. And to no surprise, his first ability is called Feast. Casting it creates a powerful vacuum that sucks nearby enemies directly into Grendel's stomach. And now that we've eaten some enemies, we can use them to get a power-up using his second ability. Casting it gives us the Nourish buff, which adds viral damage to all our weapons and abilities. Furthermore, it also makes all energy sources more effective. Nourish is an amazing ability, and is actually one of the most popular Helminth options. And lastly, we have his fourth ability. Casting it lets Grendel vomit the stored enemies out as toxic projectiles. These projectiles also slow enemies, strip their armor, and deal a decent amount of damage all at once. And honestly, there's something incredibly satisfying about Grendel's gameplay loop. Eat a group of enemies, get your Nourish buff going, then spit them right back out as toxic projectiles to kill everything else around you. And if you want to try Grendel out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Grendel in B tier. Next up we have Gyre, and she is an electricity-themed frame that can strike enemies with lightning and buff her weapons with electric damage. And her fourth ability is the core of her kit. Activating it surrounds her in an electric field that continuously shocks nearby enemies. And every critical hit she or her abilities land triggers a lightning discharge that chains outward to multiple enemies at once. And this pairs directly with her third ability, which gives her a massive critical chance bonus to all her abilities and weapon damage. So the two abilities feed into each other really nicely. And her second ability can also be used to group enemies together by pulling them into a vortex. And her first ability with its augment lets her buff her weapons with additional electricity damage and status procs. But here's the issue. Her third and fourth ability do complement each other. And with something like Roar to boost damage further, it sounds great on paper. But in practice, her ability damage just doesn't hit hard enough to keep up with Steel Path enemies. And the amount of setup required for those results is something other frames achieve much more effortlessly. And honestly, I just can't see a strong reason to pick Gyre over Volt, who is a starting frame, does the electricity theme better, and requires significantly less investment to get going. But anyways, here's the build that I've been using for her, and if you feel like I've been playing her wrong or missed something, definitely let me know in the comments. I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. But taking everything into account, I'm placing Gyre in C tier. Next up we have Harrow, and if you're looking for a frame that turns you into an absolute weapon platform with insane critical chance, fire rate, and energy sustain all in one kit, then Harrow is exactly that. And the star of the show is his fourth ability, Covenant. Activating it makes Harrow and nearby allies completely invulnerable for a short duration, and any damage absorbed during that window gets converted into a massive critical chance buff afterwards. And the best part is that headshots during the buff period give you even higher critical chance on top of that. Now to make the most of that critical window, his second ability, Penance, gives you a significant boost to both fire rate and reload speed, and it does this by sacrificing all of Harrow's shields on cast. So the more shields you have going into it, the longer the buff lasts. And this pairs really nicely with his passive, which doubles his overshield capacity and lets him start missions at full energy, meaning you always have a large pool of shields ready to fuel Penance right from the start. And while Penance is active, a portion of all damage you deal also converts directly into health for you and nearby allies. Furthermore, we can easily refill our shields using his first ability, Condemn. Casting it sends out a wave that chains nearby enemies in place, and every enemy chained instantly restores a portion of Harrow's shields. And to keep the energy flowing, his third ability Thurible channels energy into a sensor that grants energy for every kill you make while it's active. And if you want to try Harrow out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Harrow in A tier. Next up, we have Hildryn, and what makes her unique right off the bat is that she runs entirely on shields instead of energy. So instead of managing an energy pool, everything she does costs shields. And the star of the show is her second ability, Pillage. Casting it sends out a wave that simultaneously strips enemy armor and shields, while restoring a large chunk of her own shields back. And on top of that, it also cleanses all status effects on cast, making it an incredibly versatile ability that handles survivability, offense, and defense all in one button press. And fun fact, Pillage is actually one of the most popular Helminth abilities in the entire game, because other frames can slot it in to get access to that armor strip and shield restore for themselves. That alone tells you how strong it is. And her first ability equips an exalted weapon that fires powerful bolts of energy, great for taking out groups of enemies. But if you really want to push her damage further, her fourth ability is where things get interesting. Activating it has Hildryn take flight and lift nearby enemies into the air, and with the Augment Aegis Gale, her exalted weapon gains an alternate fire mode that fires a volley of projectiles that scale directly with her maximum shields. And since we're already stacking a ton of shields anyway, that alternate fire hits incredibly hard. Now, one thing worth noting is that Hildryn is significantly less effective against the infested, since they generally don't have shields or armor for Pillage to work. Anyways, if you want to try Hildryn out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Hildryn in A tier. Next up, we have Hydroid, and if you've ever wanted to play a pirate warframe that summons a giant kraken while bombarding them with corrosive rain, then Hydroid is exactly that. And the star of the show is his fourth ability, Tentacle Swarm. Casting it summons a massive kraken that sends out tentacles from every surface in a wide area, grabbing nearby enemies and suspending them in the air while continuously dealing damage. It's a great crowd control tool that keeps enemies locked down and grouped together. And with the Augment Pilfering Swarm, any enemy killed while grabbed by the tentacles has a chance to drop additional loot, making Hydroid a decent loot farming frame. His first ability, Tempest Barrage, calls down a bombardment of corrosive water missiles onto a targeted area, dealing solid damage while applying corrosive status to everything it hits. And since Hydroid's passive makes the first corrosive stack strip 50% of enemy armor immediately, even a single cast already starts stripping defenses. And with the Augment Viral Tempest, those water missiles also have a chance to apply viral status on top of that, which effectively doubles the damage enemies take, and makes everything hit significantly harder. But the real armor stripping comes from his third ability. Casting it siphons armor directly off nearby enemies, permanently degrading their armor while also buffing Hydroid's own armor and adding corrosive damage to all of his abilities and weapons. And enemies that already have corrosive status applied give an even larger boost. So the more corrosive stacks you build up beforehand with Tempest Barrage and Tentacle Swarm, the bigger the damage buff you get from Plunder. And his second ability transforms Hydroid into a wave of water that surges forward, making him completely invulnerable while traveling. And with the Augment Tidal Impunity, it also cleanses all status effects on cast, making it a great panic button for getting out of dangerous situations quickly. Now, Hydroid is a solid and well-rounded frame overall, but if loot farming is your main priority, I just feel that Khora does it more efficiently, and also brings stronger abilities to the table overall. So while Hydroid is perfectly capable, there is a better option on this list if that's what you're specifically looking for. But if you want to try Hydroid out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Hydroid in B tier. Next up, we have Inaros, and if you've ever wanted to play an unkillable sand mummy with an absolutely massive health pool, then he is exactly that. Now, he is unique in that he has no shields at all, just a huge pile of health. And in the past, this was actually a significant weakness, because without shields, he couldn't take advantage of shield gating like most other frames. But with the introduction of Arcane Persistence, that problem is essentially solved. because Arcane Persistence removes all shields, but limits the amount of damage you can take as long as you have enough armor. Which means that with the right setup, Inaros can become effectively immortal, and to further help with his tankiness, his third ability Scarab Shell gradually builds up bonus armor over time, which stacks on top of his already decent base armor. So between his enormous health pool, Scarab Shell, and Arcane Persistence, Inaros is a very durable frame on this list. But durability aside, his second ability, Sandstorm, is honestly one of the most fun abilities in the game. Activating it has Inaros transform into a tornado of sand that sucks in nearby enemies, essentially turning him into a walking black hole. It's incredibly satisfying to spin through a group of enemies and watch them all get pulled in and tossed around helplessly. And with the augment Elemental Sandstorm, Sandstorm also has a chance to inflict status effects based on the modded elements on your melee weapon. Now, objectively speaking, Inaros does have a pretty straightforward kit. He's tanky, he can group enemies, and he's incredibly hard to kill. But at the end of the day, there are plenty of other frames on this list that can do all of that, while also bringing significantly more damage, utility, or team support to the table. Now I'll be upfront, I don't have a fully updated build for Inaros at the moment, but here's a build by Ninjace that works great for Steel Path. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Inaros in B tier. Next up we have Ivara, and if you've ever wanted to play a stealthy hunter that can stay permanently invisible and eliminate your enemies with an exalted bow, then Ivara is exactly that. And her first ability is actually really cool. Cycling through it gives her access to 4 different arrow types. She has a cloak arrow which creates an invisible bubble that cloaks Ivara and any allies inside it, a sleep arrow that puts enemies to sleep on impact, a noise arrow that attracts enemies to a specific location, and the dash wire arrow that creates a zip line between 2 points. Furthermore, with the augment Empowered Quiver, the dash wire arrow grants extra critical damage to allies standing on the wire. And her third ability is her main survivability and stealth tool. Activating it turns Ivara completely invisible for as long as she has energy, and while active, she also gets a significant headshot damage bonus. The trade-off, however, is that her movement speed is reduced, and performing certain actions like bullet jumping or sprinting will break the cloak. And honestly, if you're a newer player still learning spy vaults, Prowl is probably the easiest way to get through them. Because with the augment Infiltrate, she can even pass through laser barriers completely unharmed while also moving faster during Prowl. So you can literally just walk through the entire vault at your own pace without triggering a single alarm. And her fourth ability equips an exalted bow that fires a fan of arrows in a wide spread, so it can easily hit multiple enemies at once. It's a solid damage dealer and pairs nicely with the headshot bonus from Prowl if you can land those shots consistently. Her second ability, Navigator, lets her take direct control of any projectile she fires and guide it manually to its target, which is a fun and unique mechanic, but honestly, not something I personally like using. And that brings me to where Ivara actually stands. She has a really cool and unique kit, but honestly, compared to other frames on this list, she just doesn't bring enough to the table. And even for spy missions, she loses out to a flying monkey. So while Ivara is perfectly viable, there's rarely a strong reason to reach for her over other options. But if you want to try her out for yourself, then here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Ivara in C tier. Next up we have Jade. And if you're looking for a support frame that can buff her entire squad, revive fallen allies from a distance, and still nuke enemies by herself, then Jade does all of that. And what makes her immediately stand out is her passive, because Jade is actually the only Warframe in the entire game with 2 aura mod slots, which means she can run 2 aura mods at the same time, giving her and her squad double the aura benefits right out of the gate. Now her second ability is her main team buffing tool. Cycling through it gives her 3 different hymns she can activate. She can either give extra ability strength for her and nearby allies, add a significant chunk of bonus weapon damage, or restores shields while reducing shield recharge delay. So depending on what your squad needs, you can swap between them on the fly to provide the right buff at the right time. And speaking of weapon damage, that pairs perfectly with her fourth ability. Activating it has Jade soar into the sky with angelic wings while equipping an exalted weapon called Glory, which fires heat beams at enemies below. But the real nuke comes from its alternate fire, which detonates all judgment marks on enemies in a huge area at once for massive damage. And her first ability is her primary source of applying those judgment marks. Casting it creates wells of light on the ground that continuously burn nearby enemies with heat damage and mark them with judgment, while simultaneously healing allies standing inside them. And her third ability summons a gaze that targets enemies in front of her, slowing them down and permanently dissolving their shields and armor over time. But here's one of my favorite parts about this ability, because when the gaze falls upon a fallen ally in Bleedout, it automatically revives them from a distance without Jade needing to stop what she's doing. And honestly, Jade is exactly what a support frame should be. She buffs her squad, keeps her allies alive, and still holds her own in combat without needing to sacrifice one for the other. It's a really well-rounded kit that feels genuinely useful in many situations. And if you want to try her out for yourself, this is the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Jade in A tier. Next up, we have Khora, and if you're looking for a frame that can farm extra loot, crowd control entire rooms, and deal massive damage all at the same time, then she is exactly that. And the star of the show is her fourth ability. Casting it creates a dome of chains that captures and suspends all nearby enemies in the air, leaving them completely unable to fight back. Furthermore, enemies caught inside take extra damage from all sources, and with the augment, Pilfering Strangledome, every enemy caught has a 65% chance to drop additional loot on death, making Khora hands down one of the best loot farming frames in the entire game. But here's where it gets really satisfying, because her first ability, Whipclaw, pairs directly with Strangledome in the best possible way. Hitting just one captured enemy with Whipclaw deals full damage to that target, and then immediately spreads 50% of that damage to every other enemy suspended in the same dome. So if you have a full dome packed with enemies, a single Whipclaw crack can wipe out the entire group at once. And what makes Whipclaw hit so incredibly hard is its augment called Accumulating Whipclaw, because every time you hit at least 3 enemies with a single crack, Whipclaw gains a stacking damage bonus, and those stacks keep building up, so the more you use it, the harder it hits. And if you want to try Khora out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Khora in A tier. Next up, we have Koumei, and if you've ever wanted to play a Japanese shrine maiden that rolls dices to determine the power of her abilities, then Koumei is exactly that. And yes, luck is actually a part of her kit. So before we get into her abilities, we need to talk about her passive, because every time she casts an ability, 3 dices are rolled and the total determines how powerful that ability is. Rolling higher means stronger effects across the board, and the golden result is rolling triple sixes, which unlocks special enhanced versions of several of her abilities. So every cast is a little bit of a gamble. And the star of the show is her second ability. Casting it opens a sacred fortune envelope that assigns her a small bonus challenge to complete during the mission. Things like killing a certain number of enemies while airborne, while sliding, or within a specific range. And upon completing the challenge, she earns a decree, which is a permanent buff that stacks for the rest of the mission. And here's the key part. These decrees can buff everything from ability damage and weapon damage to critical chance and status chance, and they keep stacking the more you earn throughout the mission. So the longer an endurance run goes, the stronger she becomes, which makes her an incredible pick for long survival or endurance missions. And her third ability is her main survivability tool, and it's honestly really good. Casting it surrounds her in a set of sacred charms that each give her a 50% chance to negate every incoming hit entirely. And when a charm absorbs a hit, it heals us in the process. This essentially allows us to passively shield gate. And her first ability fires elemental threads, applying random elemental status effects on every hit. And her fourth ability entraps nearby enemies in strings while pelting them with multiple stacks of random status effects, keeping them locked down and steadily burning through their health. Overall, Koumei is a really fun and unique frame to play, especially in longer endurance runs where her decrees keep stacking up. But if you're purely looking for a status frame, there is another frame on this list that does it so much better, and we'll get to her later. But if you want to try her out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Koumei in B tier. Next up, we have Kullervo. And if you've ever wanted to play as a deadly melee warrior that can teleport to enemies and strike them with devastating attacks, and spread that damage to every other enemy in the room at the same time, then Kullervo is exactly that. And the star of the show is his first ability, Wrathful Advance. Casting it has Kullervo wind up a powerful heavy attack before instantly teleporting to a target enemy and delivering it with a massive melee critical chance bonus on top. And what makes this truly special is that it pairs directly with his third ability, Collective Curse, because any damage Kullervo deals to a cursed enemy gets spread to all other cursed enemies nearby, at 50% of the original damage as true damage. So, a single, heavy attack from Wrathful Advance on one cursed target can instantly wipe out the entire group around it. It's an incredibly satisfying combo. And his second ability, Recompense, is his main survivability tool. Casting it sends daggers flying outward that seek out nearby enemies, and every enemy hit returns health and generates Overguard for Kullervo. An Overguard, as a reminder, sits on top of your health and regular shields, while also blocking status effects. Furthermore, with the Augment Cursed Efficiency, Recompense now lasts for a set duration, instead of consuming daggers, meaning you have a more consistent and reliable window to generate Overguard and keep yourself alive. And honestly, Kullervo is just incredibly strong. He hits hard, he stays alive, and has status immunity, and the combination of Wrathful Advance and Collective Curse means he can delete entire rooms with a single heavy attack. He really does have it all as a melee frame. And if you'd like to try him out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Kullervo in S tier. Next up we have Lavos. And if you've ever wanted to play as an alchemist that mixes elements together to strip enemy armor, poison entire rooms, and nuke everything in sight, then Lavos is exactly that. And what makes him truly unique is that he doesn't use energy at all. Instead, every single one of his abilities runs on cooldowns. Now, before we get into his abilities, we need to quickly talk about how his elemental infusion system works. Because by holding down any of his ability keys before casting, Lavos infuses a specific element into his next ability. And something we can do is to infuse Corrosive into his second ability, Vial Rush. Vial Rush has Lavos charge forward while dropping a trail of vials, and by infusing Corrosive into it, every enemy Lavos dashes through gets stacked with Corrosive status, which rapidly strips their armor. And his fourth ability, Catalyze, is where the nuking comes in. Casting it sends out probes in all directions that deal increased damage for every different status effect already applied to enemies. And to keep those cooldowns low so you can keep dashing and nuking, his third ability, Transmutation Probe, is key. Casting it launches an electric probe that zaps nearby enemies, and for every enemy electrocuted, it reduces the active cooldown on all of Lavos' other abilities. So, throwing it into a large group of enemies can almost instantly reset your cooldowns entirely. And his first ability, Ophidian Bite, works similarly, striking enemies with a Toxin Serpent attack that also reduces cooldowns for each enemy hit, giving you even more opportunities to keep your abilities cycling. And honestly, Lavos is a really fun and unique frame to play. The elemental mixing system feels satisfying once you get the hang of it, but in terms of raw performance, he just doesn't quite do enough to compete with the stronger frames on this list. But if you want to try Lavos out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Lavos in B tier. Next up, we have Limbo. And if you've ever wanted to play a frame that exists between two dimensions and can make defense objectives completely untouchable, then Limbo is exactly that. Now, before we get into his abilities, we need to quickly explain what the Rift actually is, because it's the foundation of his entire kit. The Rift is essentially a separate dimension that exists alongside the normal world. Enemies and players in the Rift can only be damaged by others also in the Rift, and vice versa. So by going into the Rift and staying there yourself, you essentially become untouchable to the rest of the battlefield. And his fourth ability, Cataclysm, creates a large dome that pulls everything inside it into the Rift, which is the easiest way to get a whole group of enemies into his dimension at once. And this is especially powerful for mobile defense missions, because dropping Cataclysm on an objective makes it completely invulnerable to anything outside the dome. And that's where his second ability, Stasis, comes in. Activating it freezes every enemy currently in the Rift completely in place. So combined with Cataclysm, you essentially have a room full of completely helpless enemies that cannot move, shoot, or do anything at all, while you take them out at your own pace. His third ability, Rift Surge, then applies a charge on all enemies in the Rift. And with the Augment Rift Torrent, every enemy affected by Rift Surge gives Limbo a stacking damage bonus while he's in the Rift. So the more enemies you have surged, the harder Limbo hits. which can result in some massive damage output. But here's how I feel about Limbo. His crowd control is genuinely some of the strongest in the game, and for defensive missions he is almost unmatched. But outside of that specific scenario, he just doesn't bring enough to the table compared to other frames on this list. But if you want to try Limbo out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using in the footage. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Limbo in C tier. Next up we have Loki, and if you've ever wanted to play as the ultimate trickster that can turn invisible, swap places with enemies, and disarm entire rooms in one cast, then Loki is exactly that. And his second ability, Invisibility, is his main survivability tool, and it's a really strong one. Activating it turns Loki completely invisible for a decent duration, meaning enemies simply cannot target or shoot at you while it's active. And his third ability, Switch Teleport, instantly swaps Loki's position with your targeted enemy, which is a fun mobility tool on its own. But with the Augment Safeguard Switch, Loki becomes completely invulnerable for a duration after every teleport, which turns it into another really good survivability tool. And his fourth ability, Radial Disarm, sends out a pulse that strips all nearby enemies of their weapons, forcing them to use their bare hands for the remainder of their lives. This is a pretty effective crowd control tool, since a disarmed enemy is significantly less threatening than one actively shooting at you. And with the Augment Irradiating Disarm, every disarmed enemy also gets hit with a radiation proc, which causes them to turn on each other and start fighting amongst themselves, giving you even more crowd control. But honestly, this is how I feel about Loki. His kit is perfectly functional, and invisibility combined with radial disarm is a solid combo. But similarly to Limbo, his kit feels a little dated compared to what other frames on this list can do. There are frames that go invisible, yet also bring significantly more damage or utility on top of it. But if you just want to play as the God of Mischief, then this is the build I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Loki in C tier. Next up we have Mag. And if you're looking for a frame that can crowd control enemies, strip their defenses, and deal a surprising amount of damage all through the power of magnetism, then Mag is exactly that. And the star of the show is her second ability, Magnetize. Casting it creates a magnetic field around a target enemy that anchors them in place while pulling all nearby enemies towards it. And here's the really satisfying part, because every bullet and projectile fired near the field gets absorbed into it and redirected towards its center. Furthermore, projectiles absorbed also deal extra damage, and with a weapon with high punch-through like the Nadaruk, a single shot with Magnetize can usually nuke enemies. It's an incredibly powerful damage multiplier that rewards you for just shooting at it. And her fourth ability, Crush, suspends all nearby enemies in the air and crushes them with magnetic force, knocking them down and dealing solid magnetic damage. But more importantly, it also restores shields to Mag and her allies with every damage tick, making it a way for recovering shields. And with the Augment Fracturing Crush, it can also permanently strip enemy armor on top of everything else, which pairs perfectly with Magnetize and makes everything hit significantly harder. And her third ability, Polarize, is also really useful. Casting it sends out an expanding pulse that strips enemy shields and armor, while also restoring shields to Mag and nearby allies. And with the Augment Counter Pulse, it also jams enemy weapons for a few seconds and completely disables robotic enemies on hit. Mag is just a really well-rounded and satisfying frame to play. She strips defenses, deals great damage, restores shields, and has crowd control on top of all of that. She genuinely does a lot more than most players expect. And if you want to try Mag out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Mag in A tier. Next up we have Mesa. And if you've ever wanted to play as a gunslinger that can lock onto every enemy in the room and blast them all down, then Mesa is exactly that. And the star of the show is her fourth ability, Peacemaker. Activating it has Mesa draw her exalted pistols. And while they're out, all you have to do is aim your crosshair at enemies within the focus ring, and she automatically targets and shoots everything inside it, essentially turning her into a turret with built-in aim assist. And the fire rate keeps ramping up the longer you hold the trigger, so the longer Peacemaker is active, the faster and harder she shoots. It's an incredibly satisfying ability to use. And to keep herself safe during Peacemaker, her third ability, Shatter Shield, wraps Mesa in a barrier that gives her a damage reduction against incoming gunfire and even deflects projectiles back at enemies. It's not the most impressive survivability tool on its own, but it does its job of keeping Mesa alive while she's locked in place mowing things down. And her second ability, Shooting Gallery, is an even better ability. Casting it creates a swirling effect, jamming nearby enemy weapons, while also giving us a slight weapon damage buff. But here's where Mesa runs into a bit of trouble in Steel Path specifically. She struggles quite a bit against armored enemies. And without addressing that, she can feel like she's tickling enemies that really need to go down fast. That's why I personally run Terrify with the augment Creeping Terrify on her via the Helminth system, which strips enemy armor and slows them down at the same time, making Peacemaker significantly more effective against enemies on Steel Path. And if you want to try Mesa out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Mesa in B tier. Next up we have Mirage, and if you've ever wanted to play a frame that can multiply your weapon damage, booby-trap the entire map, and nuke enemies all at the same time, then Mirage is exactly that. And honestly, she is one of those frames where every single ability in her kit is genuinely useful. So let's talk about them. Her first ability, Hall of Mirrors, is the foundation of everything. Casting it summons 3 holographic clones of Mirage that mimic her every shot and deal a portion of her damage with each attack. And what makes this so powerful is that those clones effectively multiply your damage output, especially with explosive weapons. Because every time Mirage fires a rocket or grenade, her clones fire their own copies too, and each explosion deals its own separate instance of damage. So with the right explosive weapon, a single shot from Mirage can turn into a devastating volley of explosions that can wipe out entire groups of enemies instantly. And to push that damage even further, her third ability, Eclipse, is the perfect complement. The Solar Eclipse buff gives Mirage a massive weapon damage boost, and with the augment Total Eclipse, this buff also extends to nearby allies, including your clones, which makes Mirage hit like an absolute truck. And her fourth ability, Prism, tosses out an energy prism that shoots lasers in all directions, and this ability can actually deal enough damage to kill Steel Path enemies with the right build. But perhaps her more popular nuking ability would be her second ability, Sleight of Hand, because with its augment, casting it converts all pickups in range into powerful proximity mines. So in missions like Sanctuary Onslaught or defense missions, where enemies funnel into one area, you can essentially carpet the entire map in explosives and watch enemies detonate themselves upon spawning in. And if you want to try Mirage out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using in the footage. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Mirage in A tier. Next up we have Necros, and if you're looking for a frame that can farm extra loot, crowd control enemies, and summon an army of the dead all at the same time, then Necros is exactly that. And the star of the show is his third ability, Desecrate. Activating it creates an aura around him that causes every enemy corpse nearby to have a chance to drop additional loot and health orbs when they die, and you can maintain this aura for as long as you have energy. This makes Necros a decent loot farming frame, especially in survival farms where enemies die in large numbers. And his second ability, Terrify, is arguably just as important. Casting it sends out a pulse of fear that causes all nearby enemies to drop everything and run away in a panic, giving you a massive window of breathing room. But the really useful part is that Terrify also strips enemy armor, which makes everything you do hit significantly harder. And with its augment Creeping Terrify, those fleeing enemies also get slowed to a crawl, which means they end up just standing there completely helpless with their armor removed as you pick them off one by one. It's a really effective crowd control and armor strip combo rolled into one ability. And his fourth ability, Shadows of the Dead, raises up to 7 fallen enemies as loyal shadow minions that fight alongside Necros. And to keep those shadows alive, his first ability, Soul Punch, comes in handy. Casting it on any normal enemy below 25% health instantly finishes them off, and doing so immediately heals all 7 active shadows back to full health. So it's a quick and easy way to keep your army topped up without having to worry too much about them dying. And honestly, the shadows themselves are a fun necromancer concept, but in my personal experience, they just don't do a whole lot. But if you want to try Necros out for yourself, then here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Necros in C tier. Next up we have Naja, and if you've ever wanted to play a speedy fire warrior that can impale entire rooms of enemies, spread status effects across them all, and stay alive through a divine protection, then Naja is exactly that. And his third ability, Warding Halo, is his main survivability tool. Casting it summons a fiery ring around him that absorbs 90% of all incoming damage, and it stays active until its health is fully depleted, and any enemy that wanders too close to it also gets staggered, so it does a little crowd control on top of keeping you alive. And the star of the show is his fourth ability, Divine Spears. Casting it erupts spears of light from the ground in a wide radius, impaling and completely incapacitating every enemy caught in range for a decent duration. And while they're pinned down and helpless, pressing the ability again causes all speared enemies to get slammed into the ground for a burst of damage. And with the augment Divine Retribution, any status effects applied to one speared enemy immediately spread to all other speared enemies at the same time. And when the spears retract, all those status effect damage ticks get dealt in full with a damage multiplier on top. So if you have enemies stacked with bleed or heat procs, releasing Divine Spears deals an absolutely massive burst of damage to the entire group at once. Oh, and one more thing I almost forgot to mention. His passive makes him slide faster and farther than normal, which feels incredibly fun in games. Just sliding around the map covers so much distance that getting around missions feels genuinely satisfying. It's a small but really nice quality of life passive that you'll appreciate the moment you start playing him. And if you want to try him out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing him in A tier. Next up, we have Nidus, and if you've ever wanted to play as the Infested and become basically impossible to kill, then Nidus is exactly that. And the core of everything is his passive mutation stacks, and we can easily generate these by using his abilities. And here's the really important part, because whenever Nidus would otherwise die, he instead consumes stacks to negate the damage and heal himself back up. So essentially, the more stacks he has, the more times he can dodge death entirely. It's an incredibly powerful passive that makes Nidus incredibly hard to kill. And his first ability, Virulence, is our main way of building those stacks. Casting it stomps the ground and releases a trail that spreads out in the direction you aim, and every enemy hit by it grants a mutation stack. But to get more value out of Virulence, his second ability, Larva, is essential. Casting it creates an infested pod that immediately latches onto all nearby enemies and pulls them together into one clump. So instead of enemies being spread out, they're all grouped up and ready for Virulence to hit them all at once, which means you build stacks much faster. Furthermore, enemies killed while held by Larva have a chance of generating a mutation stack as well. And his fourth ability, Ravenous, creates a field of infested growth that continuously heals us while we stand in it. But more importantly, it spawns maggots that attach to nearby enemies. And when you hit those attached maggots with Virulence, they detonate in an explosion that counts as separate hits for stacking purposes. So a room full of maggots all going off at once can grant you multiple stacks in a single cast. And with the augment Insatiable, we even get a chance to generate additional mutation stacks while standing on the spawning grounds. And if you want to try Nidus out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I feel like placing Nidus in C tier, because apart from cheating death, he doesn't bring a whole lot to the table compared to other frames on this list. Next up we have Noko, and he is an extremely powerful fungi frame. And the star of the show is his fourth ability, Spore Spring. Casting it unleashes a bouncing ballistic mushroom that seeks out enemies and explodes off every surface it touches, dealing damage in a wide area as it ricochets around the room. But here's the key part, because when that mushroom makes contact with any of Noko's other planted mushrooms, they become invigorated and double their pulse rate. So the more mushrooms you have placed around the area, the more chaotic and devastating Spore Spring becomes as it bounces between them all. And that's exactly where his first and second abilities come in, because those are what you use to set up that mushroom network beforehand. His first ability, Stink Brain, throws a mushroom that periodically releases poisonous spores around it, inflicting viral damage and status on all nearby enemies, while also lulling them to sleep. And for newer players, Viral is one of the strongest status types in the game since it doubles the damage enemies take. So having a mushroom passively stacking it on everything nearby is incredibly powerful. And his second ability, Bright Bonnet, plants a rejuvenating mushroom that emits a support pulse, restoring energy to Noko and nearby allies, while also granting a temporary boost to ability strength. So between the two, you have a mushroom that weakens enemies, and a mushroom that buffs your team, all running passively in the background while Spore Spring bounces around killing everything, while also amplifying your mushroom effects. And for survivability, his third ability, Reroute, temporarily reverts Nako into his tiny sprawling form, making him completely invulnerable while spawning orbs and giving him a speed boost. So if things ever get too dangerous, a quick Reroute gets you out of trouble. And I personally like going into his invulnerable form while watching my fourth ability kill everything in sight. And this ties directly into his passive, because if Nako ever takes fatal damage while at least one Stinkbrain or Brightbonnet Mushroom is active on the map, he automatically transforms into his invulnerable Sprawdling form instead of going into Bleed Out. And if he can reach one of his active mushrooms within 15 seconds, he fully revives with 100% health and shields. So as long as you keep mushrooms planted around the map, you essentially have a built-in second chance at life whenever things go wrong. Nako is incredibly powerful, and if you want to try him out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Nako in A tier. Next up we have Nova, and if you've ever wanted to play a frame that can slow down entire rooms of enemies to a crawl, or speed them up to rush straight into your weapons, all while priming them to explode on death, then Nova is exactly that. And the star of the show is her fourth ability, Molecular Prime. Casting it releases an expanding wave of antimatter that primes every enemy it touches, and primed enemies take double damage from all sources and explode on death, dealing damage to nearby enemies. And here's where it gets really satisfying, because that explosion also kills nearby enemies, which causes them to explode too, and those explosions damage the enemies around them, and so on. So a single kill can trigger a chain reaction that wipes out the entire room in a massive cascade of explosions. But here's what makes it truly special, because you can choose how it behaves depending on your needs. Tapping the ability slows all primed enemies down significantly, which is amazing for survivability since enemies can barely move while you pick them off one by one. But holding the ability speeds them up instead, which sounds counterintuitive but is actually incredibly useful for defense missions, because enemies will sprint directly to the objective and run straight into your weapons, killing them faster and speeding up the entire mission. And this ties directly into her first ability, Null Star. So let's talk about that. Casting it creates a set of antimatter particles that orbit Nova and automatically attack nearby enemies. And each active particle also reduces incoming damage to Nova, making it a nice survivability tool that runs in the background while you play. And with the augment Molecular Fission, killing a primed enemy restores null star charges, and the particles themselves also start inflicting molecular prime on anything they hit. And on top of that, with the augment Neutron Star, recasting our first ability disperses all active particles outward in a burst, seeking out nearby enemies and hitting them before replenishing. So with both augments running together, Nova essentially becomes a walking primer that constantly applies molecular prime to everything around her, without even needing to cast her fourth ability as often. It's an incredibly fluid and satisfying combo to play around. And if you want to try Nova out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Nova in A tier. Next up we have Nyx, and if you've ever wanted to play a psychic Warframe that can become completely immortal, strip enemy defenses, mind control enemies, and nuke everything in a massive explosion, then Nyx is exactly that. And the star of the show is her fourth ability, Absorb. Casting it has Nyx enter a meditative stance that makes her completely invulnerable, while absorbing all incoming damage into a growing damage counter. And when you release it, all that stored damage gets unleashed in a massive psychic blast that scales in size with how much damage was absorbed. But on its own, it forces you to stand completely still, which isn't great. However, with the augment Assimilate, Absorb becomes a channeled ability instead, and you can now move around freely, roll, and even shoot your weapons while being completely immortal. And on top of that, releasing Absorb after building up enough damage also gives you a 6-second window of invulnerability and a massive weapon damage buff. So you're cycling between being immortal, releasing a nuke, and immediately being invulnerable again for the follow-up. And her second ability, Psychic Bolts, is what bridges the gaps between Absorb casts. Casting it fires a volley of bolts that steals enemy armor, shields, and overguard from enemies, and spread those strips to nearby enemies on kill. So you're continuously stripping defenses and keeping your own overguard and shields topped up at the same time. And with the augment Pacifying Bolts, each bolt also inflicts a radiation proc and stuns enemies briefly, causing them to turn on each other, and giving you even more crowd control on top of everything else. And her first ability, Mind Control, is also a nice addition. Casting it on an enemy takes control of them and immediately opens a short window, where any damage you deal to them gets multiplied and added as a permanent damage boost for the duration. So if you have a large absorb counter built up and release it during that window, the damage multiplier stacks on top of everything else for a truly devastating minion. And if you ever need even more crowd control, her third ability, Chaos, sends out a psychic pulse that hits every enemy in a wide radius with radiation, causing them all to turn on each other and attack their own allies for a decent duration. Nyx has a genuinely stacked kit that covers almost every situation. And if you want to try her out for yourself, here's a quick build to get you started. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Nyx in A tier. Next up we have Oberon. And if you've ever wanted to play a nature paladin that can one-shot enemies, strip their armor, and protect allies with a mini Mesmer skin, then Oberon is exactly that. And the star of the show is his first ability, Smite. Casting it focuses deadly energy within a target, dealing massive damage to them and enemies around it. And what makes this truly special is that the damage scales as a percentage of the target's maximum health, meaning with enough ability strength or viral, it can one-shot even the toughest enemies outright. And his fourth ability, Reckoning, is also really handy. Casting it lifts all nearby enemies into the air and slams them down, dealing damage and stripping their armor in a single cast. But it does even more than that, because every enemy hit by this ability also has a 50% chance to spawn a health orb upon death. And this ties directly into his passive, which is actually really interesting, because every time Oberon picks up a health orb, he and nearby allies gain a charge of Righteous Negation. And each charge blocks an incoming hit entirely, while granting a brief moment of invulnerability. So it essentially works like Revenant's Mesmer Skin, where each charge absorbs a hit and keeps you alive. And his second ability, Hallowed Ground, sanctifies the ground around Oberon, continuously dealing radiation damage to all enemies standing inside the radius. But more importantly, it also grants Oberon and nearby allies protection against status effects while standing on it, which is a really useful defensive tool. And I'll be honest, I don't really have a polished build for Oberon, but here's one by Ninjace that works all the way to level cap. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Oberon in S tier. Next up we have Octavia, and if you've ever wanted to literally AFK while your abilities do all the work for you, then Octavia is exactly that. And yes, I mean that quite literally. And the star of the show is her first ability, Mallet. Casting it deploys a rhythmic device that naturally draws enemy attention and causes them to focus their fire on it. And here's the really important part, because Mallet absorbs all incoming damage dealt to it by enemies, and converts that absorb damage into its own outgoing damage. So the harder enemies shoot at it, the harder it nukes. And to push that damage even further, her fourth ability, Amp, is the perfect synergy, because it doubles both the damage and range of Mallet. And for survivability, her third ability, Metronome, is what keeps her alive. Activating it sets a rhythm, and by crouching in time with the beat, you gain a powerful invisibility buff that can constantly refresh as long as you crouch to the beat again. And since invisible Warframes cannot be targeted by enemies, this makes Octavia nearly untouchable. So the entire game plan is just drop Mallet, cast Amp on top of it, stay invisible with Metronome, and watch enemies melt themselves trying to shoot your Mallet. It's genuinely one of the most relaxed ways to play the game. And I know that some of you might argue that this isn't really playing the game, and honestly that's a fair point. But objectively speaking, the results speak for themselves. Octavia is genuinely a really strong and reliable Warframe. And if you want to try Octavia out for yourself, here's the build I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Octavia in S tier. Next up we have Araxia, and if you've ever wanted to play as a deadly spider queen that poisons everything in sight, cocoons enemies in webs, and commands an army of little spiders to do her bidding, then Araxia is exactly that. And the star of the show is her fourth ability, Silken Stride. Activating it makes Araxia completely immune to status effects, while also giving all of her ranged weapons bonus toxin damage. But the way this toxin damage works is the important part, because it functions a lot like Saren's Toxic Lash, which is really powerful. Instead of simply adding toxin to your weapon's damage, every weapon hit creates an extra instance of toxin damage on top of the original hit. So every shot is basically hitting twice, with the second hit dealing toxin damage. And to set up those kills, her second ability, Webbed Embrace, is an incredibly useful crowd control tool. Casting it throws a creeping web that spreads outward and ensnares every enemy caught within its widening radius, trapping them in a cocoon and applying a damage vulnerability that makes all incoming damage hit significantly harder. So enemies are not only locked in place, they're also taking increased damage from your weapons, abilities, and everything else you throw at them. And her third ability, Widow's Brood, is where things get really fun. Activating it marks enemies in front of Araxia, and killing those marked enemies spawns Scuttler minions, her little spider companions that swarm and attack nearby enemies. And these Scuttlers are more than just a cosmetic army, because they actively apply toxin procs to everything they hit. And with Archon continuity, those toxin procs also create corrosive procs, which passively strips enemy armor over time. And her first ability, Mercy's Kiss, has Araxia deliver a powerful strike, and enemies defeated by it have a high chance to drop health or energy orbs, which helps keep both your health and energy topped up, especially with Equilibrium. Overall, Araxia is honestly a very strong frame, and if you want to try Araxia out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Araxia in A tier. Next up, we have Protea. And if you've ever wanted to play as a sci-fi gadget frame that deploys floating turrets, prints free resources, and casually rewinds time when things go wrong, then Protea is exactly that. And the star of the show is her second ability, Blaze Artillery. Casting it deploys a floating plasma turret that automatically fires at enemies in front of it, and the really important part is that every enemy it hits increases its damage multiplier. So the longer it keeps shooting through groups of enemies, the harder each shot starts hitting, and in the right setup, these turrets can absolutely melt steel path enemies. But if you want to make Blaze Artillery even smoother, then her augment, Temporal Artillery, makes it way more comfortable to use. With this augment, one of your Blaze Artillery turrets follows Protea around while her fourth ability, Temporal Anchor, is active. Furthermore, the turret's duration is also paused during that time, so instead of dropping a turret and needing enemies to walk into its firing line, you basically get to carry the turret with you while it keeps blasting everything in front of you. The trade-off is that the combo count gets capped at 20, but for regular missions, the convenience is honestly huge. However, Blaze Artillery gets even better when you pair it with her fourth ability, Temporal Anchor, and more importantly, the Temporal Erosion augment. Normally, Temporal Anchor is Protea's rewind button. You activate it, do whatever you need to do for a few seconds, and when it ends, Protea rewinds back to where she started, restoring her ammo, energy, shields, and health back to that earlier point. But with the Temporal Erosion augment equipped, Blaze Artillery will also strip enemy armor while Temporal Anchor is active. And that is a massive deal, because now your turrets are not just dealing heat damage and ramping up their damage multiplier, they are also removing armor at the same time. So enemies become weaker, your turret damage hits harder, and Protea starts snowballing really quickly. Then we have her first ability, Grenade Fan, and this is basically Protea's main survival tool. Holding the ability creates shield satellites that can attach to Protea and her allies, giving them bonus shields over time. And when your shields break, one of those satellites gets destroyed to increase your shield gate invincibility time. So as long as you keep refreshing your shield satellites, Protea becomes surprisingly hard to kill. And if you want to try Protea out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Protea in A tier. Next up, we have Corvex. And if you've ever wanted to vaporize enemies with a giant nuclear beam fired directly from your chest, then Corvex is exactly that. His kit is mostly built around spreading radiation, placing down Chirinka pillars, grouping enemies with his wall, and then firing crucible blasts through everything to trigger big radiation chain reactions. And to be fair, when everything lines up properly, it can look pretty cool. But personally, Corvex just does not really click with me. I know his wall is meant to help group enemies into a line, but having to line up the pillars, the enemies, and the laser blast just feels awkward compared to other frames that can clear rooms with much less setup. And even looking at him more objectively, I do not think he brings that much to the table compared to other Warframes. He has some crowd control and some damage, but none of it feels strong or convenient enough to make him stand out. Maybe I am missing something, or maybe I am just playing him wrong. So if you are a Corvex main, let me know in the comments what makes him good. So with all that said, I feel like placing Corvex in D tier. Next up, we have Revenant. And if you want a Warframe that makes dying feel optional while still giving you multiple ways to clear high-level enemies, then Revenant is exactly that. And the star of the show is easily his second ability, Mesmer Skin. This is Revenant's most famous ability, and it is the main reason he is one of the best tanks in the entire game. Activating it gives him a number of charges that completely prevent incoming damage, and enemies that attack him get stunned instead. So instead of relying on armor, shields, or health, Revenant just says no to damage entirely. And because Mesmer Skin blocks hits regardless of how hard those hits are, it scales extremely well into higher level content. But Revenant is not just a tank, because something else in his kit also scales, and that is his fourth ability, Dance Macabre. Activating it makes Revenant spin around while firing energy beams in every direction, and while the ability is active, damage received by Revenant is stored into a damage pool. That stored damage is then added to each beam as flat bonus damage, meaning the more enemies try to hurt you, the harder your laser show hits back. And the best part is that you are not completely slow either, because you can use his third ability, Reeve, to dash around during Dance Macabre. But Reeve is not only for movement, because it also has a really strong interaction with his first ability, Enthrall. Revenant can turn enemies into thralls with his first ability, then Reeve through them to drain a huge chunk of their health and shields. And because this damage is percentage-based, it also scales extremely well. Overall, Revenant is insanely strong. Mesmer Skin makes him one of the safest frames in the game. Dance Macabre gives him a scaling area damage option, and the Enthrall plus Reeve combo gives him a way to nuke enemies that stays relevant even at high levels. He is easy to survive with, hard to punish, and has multiple ways to scale into harder content. And if you want to try Revenant out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using in the footage. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Revenant in S tier. Next up we have Rhino, and while most people just think of him as a basic tank, Rhino actually brings way more utility than just being hard to kill. But to no surprise, his most popular ability is easily his second ability, Iron Skin. Activating it gives Rhino a protective layer of armor that absorbs incoming damage before his actual health or shields are touched. And because Iron Skin can absorb damage during its initial invulnerability window to increase how much protection it gives, Rhino can become insanely durable. So instead of constantly worrying about shield gating or healing, Rhino just puts on Iron Skin and keeps moving. But what makes Iron Skin even better is that Rhino has a way to restore it using his fourth ability, Rhino Stomp, with the Reinforcing Stomp augment. Normally, Rhino Stomp is already a great crowd control tool, because Rhino slams the ground so hard that enemies around him get suspended in the air and basically stop playing the game for a few seconds. But with Reinforcing Stomp equipped, every enemy affected by Rhino Stomp also replenishes a percentage of Iron Skin's health. So if your Iron Skin starts getting low, you can stomp a group of enemies, freeze the room, and refill your defenses at the same time. And then we have Roar, which is one of the best damage buffs in the entire game. Roar boosts the damage dealt by Rhino and his allies, but the reason it is so strong is because it works like faction damage, meaning it is applied on top of your other damage bonuses instead of just being another basic additive buff. So whether you are using weapons, abilities, status effects, or damage over time effects, Roar can massively increase your overall damage output. Overall, Rhino is a ridiculously strong Warframe. He is tanky, has great crowd control, can maintain his own Iron Skin, and gives one of the strongest universal damage buffs in the game to both himself and his team. And if you want to try Rhino out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Rhino in S tier. Next up we have Citrine, and if you want to play as one of the strongest weapon platforms in the entire game, then Citrine is exactly that. Most people know Citrine for spreading spores and melting rooms over time, but what makes her really insane is that she can stack multiple weapon buffs together, starting with her first ability, Spores, and more importantly, its augment, Venom Dose. Because with Venom Dose, you can hold the ability to give Citrine and nearby allies bonus corrosive damage on all attacks. So right away, your weapons are getting a strong elemental damage buff that also helps against armor. But then we get to her third ability, Toxic Lash. And this is where Citrine becomes ridiculous. Because while active, her attacks deal additional toxin damage. But the important part is how this damage is applied. Toxic Lash does not just add some toxin onto your weapon, like a normal elemental mod. Instead, every weapon hit creates an extra hit of toxin damage. And that extra hit also has a guaranteed toxin proc. So every shot, every slash, and every melee hit starts applying even more damage on top of your original hit. And the scaling gets even crazier when you add faction damage into the mix. Because of how Toxic Lash works, faction damage can multiply the weapon's original hit, then multiply the Toxic Lash extra hit again, and then multiply the toxin damage over time ticks a third time. So you get this disgusting triple dipping effect where one damage buff ends up scaling multiple layers of damage at once. And the best part is, we can easily get that faction damage by replacing one of her abilities with Roar through Helminth. Since Roar works like faction damage, it pairs insanely well with Toxic Lash. So now you have Venom Dose giving corrosive damage, Toxic Lash adding extra toxin hits with guaranteed toxin procs, and Roar multiplying all of that damage even further. When you put everything together, Citrine is absolutely insane. She is one of the strongest weapon platforms in the game, with multiple layers of damage buffs stacking on top of each other in a way that makes your weapons hit incredibly hard. And if you want to try Citrine out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using in the footage. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Citrine in S tier. Next up we have Sevagoth, and if you want a Warframe that can delete even the toughest enemies by turning their own health bar against them, then Sevagoth is exactly that. And the main reason Sevagoth is so powerful is because of the interaction between his first ability, Reap, and his second ability, Sow. Sow marks enemies with a damage overtime effect, and when you send Reap through those enemies, it triggers a detonation that deals damage based on a percentage of their health. And because this damage is percentage-based, it scales insanely well, even against high-level enemies with massive health pools. So instead of needing raw damage numbers to keep up, Sevagoth can just nuke enemies based on how tanky they already are. The stronger the enemies get, the more valuable percentage damage becomes, and that is what makes his nuking potential so ridiculous. And when you combine this with Roar through Helminth, things get even more disgusting. Since Roar boosts the damage even further, Reap and Sow can reach the point where Sevagoth is nuking enemies at basically any level in the game. You mark them, send out Reap, and everything just collapses. Sevagoth is an insanely strong Warframe. He has scaling percentage-based damage, one of the strongest nuking setups in the game, and with Roar, he can wipe out even the toughest enemies without caring how high their level gets. And if you want to try Sevagoth out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. Do note that you do need 255% ability strength on both Roar and Reap in order to one-shot enemies outright, but you can either use Archon shards to achieve this, or simply prime enemies with Viral. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Sevagoth in S tier. Next up we have Styanax, and if you want a Spartan warrior that can rain down javelins from the sky, then Styanax is exactly that. And the star of the show is his fourth ability, Final Stand. Activating it makes Styanax leap into the air and throw a barrage of spears at enemies below him, dealing damage in a wide area. And with the Intrepid Stand augment, this ability also generates Overguard for Styanax, which gives him a nice layer of survivability while he is spamming his main damage ability. And to help us deal more damage, he also has his second ability, Theros Strike. This lets Styanax strip enemy armor, which is extremely useful because removing armor makes enemies take way more damage from his spears and weapons. So the basic loop is pretty simple. Strip armor with Theros Strike, then use Final Stand to throw spears and clear everything in front of you. And to keep his energy going, he has his third ability, Rally Point. This gives him and his allies energy regeneration, so he can cast his abilities more often without running dry too quickly. So on paper, Styanax has damage, armor strip, energy sustain, and even overguard support with his augment. But overall, I do not think Styanax brings enough compared to a lot of other Warframes. His kit is useful and he definitely works, but Final Stand just does not hit hard enough for me to feel like ranking him higher. But if you're interested in trying Styanax out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Styanax in B tier. Next up we have Temple, and if you want a rockstar Warframe that shreds enemies with an exalted guitar flamethrower, then Temple is exactly that. And the star of the show is her fourth ability, Exalted Solo. Activating it brings out her exalted guitar weapon, which basically plays like the Ignis Wraith. You hold down the trigger, spray fire everywhere, and anything caught in front of you starts burning. So if you like simple, satisfying beam weapons that just melt groups of enemies, Exalted Solo is the main reason to play her. But to keep Exalted Solo going, you need to build up its charge. which basically works like ammo for the guitar. And that is where her first ability, Pyrotechnics, and her second ability, Overdrive, come in. Both abilities can generate charge for Exalted Solo, but only if you cast them in tune with the beat. So Temple's playstyle is not just about pulling out the guitar and spraying fire forever. You need to keep playing in rhythm to refill your ammo and keep the concert going. And we have her third ability, Ripper's Wail, which gives her a heat damage buff. And since Exalted Solo is already built around burning enemies down, this fits perfectly into her playstyle. You buff yourself, charge up your solo, pull out the guitar, and start turning the mission into a concert, where the enemies are very much not having a good time. And for now, I'm going to hold off on giving Temple a proper rating or build, because her new augment is coming out soon, which gives her access to Overguard generation. So once that augment is actually here, and I've had time to test it properly, I'll revisit Temple and make a dedicated video about them. Next up, we have Titania. And if you want to play the fastest Warframe in the entire game with an amazing exalted weapon, then she is exactly that. And the star of the show is her fourth ability, Razor Wing. Activating it shrinks her down and lets her fly around freely, and gives her access to her exalted pistols, Dex Pixia. And these things are genuinely strong. But what truly turns her into the speedrun Warframe is her augment, Razor Wing Blitz. Because with this augment, casting abilities while Razor Wing is active massively increases her flight speed and fire rate. So once you stack it up, we move ridiculously fast to the point where we can fly through missions faster than almost any other frame in the game. And if you want to lean even harder into that speedrun playstyle, you can put Thermal Sunder on her through Helminth. This lets her blitz through the star chart while nuking everything around her with Thermal Sunder, which is why she is so popular for fast clears and lower level farming. She also has some nice survivability tools. Her first ability, Spellbind, gives her status immunity, which is extremely useful because getting knocked down or hit by annoying status effects while flying around would feel terrible. And her second ability, Tribute, gives her extra defensive buffs, like slowing enemies, reducing enemy accuracy, and redirecting some damage away from herself. Overall, Titania is an amazing Warframe. She is incredibly fast, her exalted weapons are strong, she has status immunity, and she's one of the best speedrunning frames in the game. When it comes to fast clears and blitzing through content, Titania is absolutely one of the best. And if you want to try her out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Titania in S tier. Next up, we have Trinity, and her main support ability is her fourth ability, Blessing. Casting it restores the health and shields of allies within affinity range, while also reducing the damage they take from enemies. So on paper, this is a really strong team survival tool, especially for keeping everyone topped up during longer missions. And with the Champion's Blessing augment, Trinity can also turn that healing into a weapon buff, giving herself bonus critical chance for primary and secondary weapons based on the amount of health healed. The problem is, honestly, I find this pretty gimmicky. Warframes barely take health damage these days because of shield gating, overguard, and other survival tools. And if a frame does start taking actual health damage and high-level content, they are usually already in serious trouble. So a lot of the time, the way people force this augment to work is by using combat discipline to damage themselves, then healing it back with Blessing just to activate the buff. Then we have her second ability, Energy Vampire. It lets Trinity generate energy for the team, and with the Vampire Leech augment, any excess energy gets converted into shields and even overshields, so she can help with both energy sustain and extra shielding, which is nice. She also has her third ability, Link, which redirects some damage to connected enemies. And with the Abating Link augment, those linked enemies also have their armor reduced, giving Trinity some armor strip on top of her support tools. But overall, I just don't really like her design. She is not useless and she can still support the team, but she feels very outdated compared to newer support frames. Jade feels much more like what a modern support Warframe should be. And even things like Nourish or Nako's Subsume can give frames strong energy support, while also adding extra value like ability strength or damage. So to me, Trinity feels kind of redundant as a support now. But if she sounds like your cup of tea and you want to try her out, then here's the build I'm using in the footage. And taking everything into account, I feel like placing Trinity in C tier. Next up we have Uriel, and if you want a demon summoning Warframe that builds up to a massive map-wide fire nuke, then Uriel is exactly that. And the most iconic ability in his kit is easily his fourth ability, Brimstone. Once charged, will unleash flaming brimstone that burns everything around us. And the best part is that the damage dealt by this ramps up with each consecutive hit, so it can wipe out huge groups of enemies really quickly. The easiest way to charge brimstone is with his third ability, Demonium. Casting it sends out the souls of his demons to hunt enemies, and when they hit, they explode and make enemies more vulnerable to damage. But Demonium also drains some of his demons' health, so Uriel is not just casting for free. His whole kit revolves around managing his demon companions, while using them to fuel his bigger attacks. And let's talk about his demons. Uriel has 3 demon companions that help him in the background, and his abilities interact with them in different ways. They are not just there for decoration either, because they help us spread damage, generate orbs, and even buff our weapons' damage. And to keep them alive, we can use his second ability, Remedium. This heals both Uriel and his demons, and if the demons are dead, it can bring them back instead. So after using Demonium to drain them, you can use Remedium to recover, reset the loop, and keep building toward another brimstone nuke. And then we have his first ability, Infernalis, which is honestly just really fun. It surrounds Uriel with flames, but the coolest part is that it also lets him take flight while airborne, turning him into a flaming meteor. So on top of being a demon commander with a massive fire nuke, he also gets a really satisfying mobility tool. And if you want to try Uriel out for yourself, here's a hybrid build that I recommend. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Uriel in A tier. Next up we have Valkyr, and if you want to play a crazy unstoppable cat lady that tears everything apart with melee claws, then she is exactly that. And the star of the show is her fourth ability, Hysteria. Activating it makes Valkyr pull out her deadly claws and start ripping through enemies with her exalted melee weapon. And while Hysteria is active, she also heals herself through her attacks, becomes immune to status effects, and gets even more value from Warcry's armor bonus. So once Valkyr enters Hysteria, she becomes incredibly hard to stop while tearing through enemies up close. And speaking of Warcry, casting it gives Valkyr and nearby allies bonus armor and attack speed, which is exactly what a melee-focused frame wants. Her passive also pushes this melee playstyle even further, because Valkyr builds rage by meleeing and killing enemies. This can give her up to 300% bonus melee damage, which is already a huge damage increase. But the really crazy part is that if Valkyr takes a fatal hit while she has enough rage, that rage gets consumed to prevent death, fully heal her, and give her a few seconds of invulnerability. And because this has no cooldown, Valkyr can feel almost impossible to put down as long as she keeps fighting. And to make her melee damage hit even harder, she also has Paralysis. Casting it releases a damaging blast that slows enemies and increases their melee damage vulnerability, making them take more damage from Valkyr's attacks. And to help with that setup, she has Ripline. Casting it throws out a hook that can pull her toward whatever it hits, which gives her some nice mobility. But if it hits an enemy, it can also pull nearby enemies in and trigger a coordinated melee attack, helping group enemies together. So you can follow up with Paralysis and start cutting everything down. Overall, Valkyr is a very strong melee warframe. And if you want to try Valkyr out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Valkyr in A tier. Next up we have Vauban. And if you want a warframe that turns the entire room into a physics experiment full of traps, mines, lasers, and helpless enemies floating in the air, then he is exactly that. And the star of the show is his fourth ability. Casting it creates a containment field that captures enemies and suspends them in stasis, while also stripping their armor and giving that armor to us and our allies standing inside the field. But the best part is that you can hold the ability to collapse it into a vortex, which pulls enemies into one tight group while dealing damage. So the basic loop is very simple. You suspend enemies, strip their armor, then collapse everything into one pile and delete them. And we actually have a few ways to take advantage of that grouping. With Mine Layer, we can throw out Tether Flechette, which launches deadly nails in all directions. So once enemies are grouped up, Flechette Orb can shred through them while they are stuck in place. But if you would rather use weapons instead, we also have Vector Overdrive. This creates a pad that launches enemies and allies in a direction, while giving allies bonus movement speed and weapon damage. Then there is Photon Strike, which lets us call down a big laser blast to damage enemies directly. And we even have Tesla Nervos for extra crowd control, because the little rollers can latch onto enemies and stun them. Overall, Vauban is a very strong control frame. And if you want to try him out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Vauban in A tier. Next up we have Volt, and he is the speedy lightning frame. And my favorite ability is his fourth one, Discharge. Casting it sends out a massive electric pulse that shocks enemies in a wide area, crowd controlling them while dealing electric damage. Against lower-level enemies, this can also work as a really strong room nuke, letting Volt clear entire groups with one cast. But Discharge also becomes a survivability tool with the Capacitance augment. With this augment, a portion of the damage dealt by Discharge gets converted into shields for Volt and his allies. Then we have Electric Shield, which we can place down as a shield that blocks enemy fire, and any projectiles shot through it by us gains bonus electricity damage. And, of course, we have Speed, which is one of the reasons Volt is so popular. Casting it gives us and nearby allies a movement speed boost and a reload speed buff, making missions feel much faster. Whether you are rushing captures, farming relics, or just moving through the map, speed is always useful. And even his first ability, Shock, adds more weapon buffing with the Shock Trooper augment. With this augment, you can hold to cast Shock to send out a wave of energy that gives Volt and nearby allies bonus electricity damage on all attacks. Overall, Volt is an amazing Warframe. He has speed, crowd control, shield generation, weapon buffs, defensive utility, and lower-level nuking all packed into one kit. And if you want to try Volt out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Volt in S tier. Next up we have Varuna, and if you want a status-spreading monster that tears through enemies like a true predator, then Varuna is exactly that. And the most potent ability in her kit is her second ability, Fangs of Raksh. Casting it applies 5 random status effects at 10 stacks each on an enemy, which is already a ridiculous amount of status in one cast. But the real power comes when that enemy dies, because those status effects then spread to nearby enemies. And this pairs perfectly with her third ability, Lycath's Hunt. While active, enemies killed by melee attacks drop health orbs, but more importantly, killing enemies affected by 5 or more status effects increases the duration of Lycath's Hunt. So Fangs of Raksh sets enemies up with the exact condition she needs, and as long as you keep killing status-affected enemies, the hunt just keeps going. Then we have her fourth ability, Ulfrin's Descent, which is how Varuna turns all that status setup into damage. Activating it makes Varuna drop to all fours and prepare 5 brutal charges that lock onto enemies. These charges deal increased damage to enemies affected by status effects, and, if the attack kills, the damage of the remaining charges gets doubled. So once you prime enemies with Fangs of Raksh, Ulfrin's Descent can start chaining kills and ramping harder with every lethal strike. And for survivability, she has her first ability, Shroud of Dinar. This gives Varuna invisibility and extra speed, letting her reposition safely before attacking. And when the invisibility ends, her melee attacks gain increased critical damage, status chance, critical chance, and even apply/status effects. Overall, Varuna is an insane status-spreading Warframe. She can flood enemies with status effects, sustain herself with health and energy orbs, go invisible for safety, and then cash in all that setup with Ulfrin's Descent for huge scaling damage. She has damage, survivability, sustain, and a really satisfying kill chain playstyle. And if you want to try Varuna out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Varuna in S tier. Next up we have Wisp, and if you want someone that has incredible survivability, crowd control, and damage amplification, then Wisp is exactly that. And honestly, we have to start with her passive because Wisp might have one of the strongest passives in the entire game. While she is airborne, Wisp becomes invisible to enemies, and this invisibility can last indefinitely as long as she does not land or fire a weapon. And even after firing, the cloak comes back shortly after you stop shooting, as long as you are still in the air. So by simply jumping around, Wisp gets a ridiculous amount of free survivability. Then we have her first ability, Reservoirs, which is one of the best support abilities in the game. Haste motes give you movement speed, melee speed, and weapon fire rate, which makes both Wisp and her team feel way faster and stronger. Meanwhile, shock motes provide constant crowd control by shocking nearby enemies. And this pairs perfectly with her third ability, Breach Surge. Casting it opens a dimensional breach that blinds nearby enemies, and when those enemies are damaged, they release aggressive surge sparks that hit other enemies. This is already extremely powerful on its own, but Wisp can also target one of her reservoirs to teleport to it and double the range of Breach Surge. So with good moat placement, she can cover a huge area, crowd control enemies, and massively amplify her damage potential all at once. She also has Will-O-Wisp, which is a very strong survivability tool. Tapping it creates a decoy and makes Wisp invisible, which can help her reposition safely. And with Augur mods, casting it can also fully reset her shield gate. But if things get really dangerous, you can double tap the ability to gain a few seconds of invulnerability, which is especially useful if you are dealing with damaging status effects. Overall, Wisp is an incredible Warframe. She has one of the best passives in the game, amazing team buffs, strong crowd control, damage amplification from Breach Surge, and emergency invulnerability. She is one of the easiest frames to justify bringing anywhere. And if you want to try Wisp out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Wisp in A tier. Next up, we have Wukong. And if you want a Warframe that is fast, easy to play, really strong in melee combat, yet also amazing for spy missions, then Wukong is exactly that. And his most popular ability is easily his second ability, Cloudwalker. This is one of the best mobility tools in the entire game, because Wukong turns into a cloud and can fly around extremely quickly while becoming invisible and invulnerable. But that is not even all it does, because Cloudwalker also cleanses status effects, heals Wukong, and lets him bypass lasers and sensors. This ability alone is basically why Wukong is the best Warframe for spy missions. You can fly through tiles, ignore traps, bypass security, all while being completely invisible. Then we have his first ability, Celestial Twin, which summons a clone to fight alongside you. The twin can help shoot enemies, draw attention, and add extra damage while you focus on whatever you want to do. And for extra survivability, he also has Defy. Activating it makes Wukong and his twin invulnerable, while enemies are encouraged to attack him. All the damage taken during this time is stored, then released back in a powerful staff strike. And after that, Wukong gains bonus armor based on the damage captured. And finally, we have Primal Fury, his Exalted Staff. After the Exalted weapon changes allowing arcanes on Exalted weapons, Primal Fury is much stronger than it used to be, and the weapon also has huge range, letting Wukong hit groups of enemies very comfortably. So if you want to lean into the Monkey King fantasy and beat everything down with a giant staff, Wukong can absolutely do that too. Overall, Wukong is an extremely strong and comfortable Warframe. He has one of the best mobility abilities in the game, amazing spy mission utility, healing, invulnerability, status cleanse, a clone that fights with him, bonus armor, and a powerful exalted melee weapon. And if you want to try Wukong out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Wukong in A tier. Next up we have Zaku. And if you want a Warframe that steals enemy weapons, turns them into scaling auto turrets, strips armor, buffs weapons with void damage, and freezes ability timers so everything lasts forever, then Zaku is exactly that. And the star of the show is definitely their second ability, Grasp of Look. Casting it near enemies lets Zaku steal their weapons and turn them into floating guns that automatically shoot nearby enemies. And the crazy part is that these guns scale with enemy level. So the higher level the enemies are, the harder your stolen guns hit, which means Zaku can scale all the way into extremely high-level content. But before you cast everything else, you usually want to activate their fourth ability, the Vast Untime. This is what ties the whole kit together, because while it is active, it freezes the timers of Zaku's other abilities. It also slows enemies around you and makes them more vulnerable to void damage, which pairs perfectly with their first ability, Zada's Whisper, which buffs your weapons with bonus void damage. This is especially useful against things like Thrax and Overguard. And Void status also creates bubbles that pull projectiles into them. So on top of being a weapon damage buff, it adds even more utility and helps Zaku deal with enemy types that normally feel annoying. And for armor strip, Zaku has Gaze from the Lost. Ideally, you cast Gaze on up to 2 enemies placed apart from each other, creating large zones that strip armor from anything inside. And if you use Accuse first to convert enemies into allies, then Gaze one of those accused enemies. The rest of the enemies are less likely to waste time attacking the target you are using for armor strip. So Zaku can create these passive armor strip zones while their stolen guns do all the killing. Overall, Zaku is an insanely strong scaling Warframe. They have level scaling auto turrets, weapon buffs, void damage vulnerability, armor strip, crowd control, timer freezing, and a playstyle that only gets stronger as enemy levels go higher. And if you want to try Zaku out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Zaku in S tier. Next up, we have Yareli. And if you want a Warframe built around speeding through missions while turning your secondary weapon into a monster, then Yareli is exactly that. And the main thing Yareli is known for is being a secondary weapon platform. Her passive, Critical Flow, gives her secondary weapon 200% bonus critical chance as long as she keeps moving for a short time. And because Yareli naturally wants to stay mobile anyway, this is basically a massive free crit buff just for playing her normally. And to push her damage even further, she has her first ability, Sea Snares. Casting it sends out water globules that seek enemies, trap them in place, and make them take increased damage from all sources. Then we have her fourth ability, Riptide, which gives her a grouping tool. Yareli pulls enemies into a watery maelstrom before exploding it outward, and this helps bunch enemies together so you can follow up with your weapons or abilities more easily. And for survivability, she has Marulina. This lets Yareli ride her wave creature while absorbing a large portion of incoming damage, giving her a strong defensive layer while she stays mobile. But if you do not like riding Marulina, you can use the loyal Marulina augment instead. This disables the riding part of Marulina, and instead makes Marulina follow Yareli around while automatically shooting sea snares at enemies. So you still get value from the ability without having to deal with the K-Drive movement. Overall, Yareli is a very strong secondary platform Warframe. She has a huge crit chance buff, damage vulnerability, crowd control, grouping, and survivability through Marulina. And if you want to try Yareli out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Yareli in S tier. Next up we have Zephyr, and if you want a Warframe that controls the battlefield with tornadoes, flies through maps, and casually ignores most incoming projectiles, then Zephyr is exactly that. And the star of the show is her fourth ability, Tornado. Holding the ability creates 3 stationary tornadoes, while tapping it creates 3 homing tornadoes that chase enemies. And if you aim down sights, you can even guide the closest homing tornado, which gives you more control over where your damage and crowd control goes. The reason Tornado is so strong is because you can hit the tornadoes with your status weapons, and that damage gets spread into the enemies caught inside. And to make that even easier, she has her second ability, Airburst. Tapping it creates a vortex that pulls enemies together, which helps suck enemies into your tornadoes much faster. You can even aim near the edge of the tornado pull radius to drag more enemies into the kill zone. Then we have her third ability, Turbulence, which is her main survivability tool. You basically want to keep this active as much as possible, because it redirects incoming enemy fire away from Zephyr. This makes her incredibly safe, and it can also help protect defense objectives if you position yourself properly. And finally, her first ability, Tailwind, gives her both mobility and damage potential. You can tap it to fly across the map quickly, but you can also hold it while airborne to hover in place. And due to her passive, Zephyr gets a huge critical chance bonus while in the air. Overall, Zephyr is insanely strong. And if you want to try Zephyr out for yourself, here's the build that I'm using. And taking everything into account, I'm placing Zephyr in S tier. And if you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much. You are absolutely insane because going through 64 Warframes is definitely not a short journey. Of course, with that many frames, there are probably some details I missed, or maybe you have a completely different rating or opinion on some of them. So if you have a different rating in mind, or if there's a build or interaction I should have mentioned, let me know in the comments. And if you want to see my fashion for every Warframe, I'll leave the link to that video down in the description. And a huge shout out to Alaika, Silverwolf, and all my generous channel members who help support the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.